I always thought that Kate and I would be fine. We had been through a lot, and despite the challenges, it seemed like everything was good between us. It was so simple. I worked, earned money, and she stayed home, taking care of the house and maintaining our comfort. We didn't spend much time together, but I was sure it wasn't a problem. We were each busy with our own things, but we still knew we had each other. Strange, but I always felt that stability was what mattered in a relationship. A home, a job, plans for the future, everything was going as it should, and I thought that was happiness. Sometimes, when I stayed late at work or came home late, I promised myself that next time would be different. That next time I'd come home earlier, that we'd spend the evening together, that I'd bring her back into my life like it used to be, when everything felt truly close and warm. Somehow, I didn't notice that we were actually drifting apart. I comforted myself with the thought that everything would be fine. Like many people, I was just going through the motions, forgetting that relationships require effort and attention, not just mechanical stability. Today was one of those evenings when I decided that everything had to be different. I came home a little earlier than usual, thinking I could surprise Kate, truly make her happy. I planned to cook her favorite dish and spend the evening together, just like before. A quiet dinner and a conversation, nothing special, but something sincere, from the heart. I even thought ahead about how I would arrange the evening, how cozy it would be, how everything would be in its place. I imagined us sitting at the table, laughing, talking about the little things that were so important to us. But when I opened the door, I didn't expect this evening to be completely different. When I opened the door, I immediately sensed that something was wrong. There was a strange silence in the air, even more tense than usual. I felt it, like an intuitive premonition, that something was happening, something important. And there she was, sitting on the couch, Kate, with Michael next to her. And this was no ordinary scene. I always thought that if something were to happen, I would notice. But now, it felt like I was standing in a different world. They were sitting close, too close. I saw their eyes meet, as if something important, something not for me, was said. My mind seemed to push all thoughts aside. This couldn't be real. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. And when their eyes met mine, I realized I couldn't change it. This wasn't a random moment, it was reality. I stood still, paralyzed. It was as if, in that moment, everything I knew suddenly vanished, and I was no longer in my own life. This couldn't be real. I couldn't understand what was happening. It was like being in a movie, where I was an outsider. Where I was unnecessary, where I didn't belong in this story. Kate didn't look surprised. She didn't even try to hide her reaction. She simply lifted her gaze, looked at me coldly, and spoke as though nothing had happened. "What are you doing here?" Her voice was indifferent, yet it sounded like she already knew I would walk in like I was a rare intruder in their peaceful world. "What do you think, Kate?" I couldn't hold back my anger, not knowing what to do with all of this. "Are you going to explain to me what's going on here?" Silence. She looked at Michael again, then back at me. In her eyes, there was no shame, no apologies. Just emptiness. This wasn't my Kate. This was a stranger, with a stranger's eyes, avoiding mine. I didn't know what to think. This was the moment I realized I meant nothing. Michael didn't move. He sat there with such confidence, as if all of this had been planned in advance. His gaze was cold, emotionless. He didn't try to apologize, didn't try to hide his role. His presence in our home was so natural to him, as though he had always been here. "I see you don't like me being here," he said, glancing at me. His voice was calm, but there wasn't even a hint of apology. "But this isn't your situation anymore, ma'am." I stood in the doorway, unable to comprehend how I had ended up in this nightmare. Everything I knew, Everything I had built had collapsed in an instant. Words didn't come, my head was empty. I just stood there, trying to process what was happening. Unable to bear it, I stepped back into the hallway, trying to gather my thoughts. I heard them start speaking quietly, their voices muffled, but I could hear every word. I wanted to disappear, but I couldn't leave, I was tied to this moment. I stepped a little closer, unable to look away. With every word, I felt myself breaking. My body was shaking from some internal burning shame. I heard their conversation, everything was so clear and brutal. "You're not leaving, you know that," Michael said with such certainty that it made me feel sick. Kate didn't answer. I heard her breathing become heavier, as though she was trying to hide something. This wasn't just silence, it was silence filled with something I couldn't understand, couldn't accept. "You can't do this, Michael. You don't understand, it's not that simple." Her voice trembled, but she held herself together. I didn't know if it was fear or regret. I couldn't understand what was going on in her head. "You're ready for this, Kate," Michael replied sharply. "You made this choice, you made your decision." I was so close now, I could barely breathe. It felt like some unspeakable truth was hanging in the air, something that was tearing me apart. It was like I was standing on the edge of an abyss. "You can't back out, you know that." His voice was like ice, cutting to the soul, making me feel that this situation had no way back. The moment stretched on, and I froze, realizing the full weight of what was happening. I understood that now this was no longer just an experience, it was my life, destroyed in an instant. Everything I had loved, everything I had known, had lost its meaning. I stepped back, unable to bear the pain, and felt the walls around me starting to close in, as if my life was beginning to disappear. When I returned home, the door creaked again, but this time I didn't feel the comfort that had always been associated with that sound. It was just a door. I entered the apartment, and immediately I was met with the cold that filled the space. Kate was sitting on the couch as if nothing had happened, her gaze empty and expressionless. She didn't even notice me enter, or maybe pretended not to. I stood still, not knowing what to do. I couldn't approach her. I didn't know where to start. "Did you ever love me?" I asked, my voice weak, almost quiet. I was surprised that my words sounded like that. It wasn't anger, it was desperation. Kate didn't respond immediately. She looked at me as if through me, like I was just part of the scenery, not a person. There was nothing in her eyes, just emptiness. "I tried," she said, her voice flat, unchanged. Those words hit me in the chest. I stood there, not knowing what to do with them. What had she tried, and why? For whom? I didn't know what to say, but a feeling of disappointment overwhelmed me. I thought that if only she had tried to understand what all of this meant to me. But nothing. Silence filled the room. It was like she had drowned in it. I stood, waiting for her to say something more, to make this not so final. But nothing. She sat on the couch, waiting, as though this conversation was unnecessary. Like she had already closed all the questions for herself. "Do you even understand what happened?" I asked, unable to hold it in, but my voice trembled, as if I didn't want to hear the answer. Kate lifted her gaze, but she didn't say anything. She just remained silent. It was like a blow. Each of her silences echoed in my head. I thought we had a chance, I continued, even though I knew it didn't matter. But I guess I was wrong. She remained silent. She didn't even try to explain. I felt the walls closing in, like the entire space around me was becoming foreign. This wasn't my room, it was someone else's life. You know, I would have understood if you had told me that you couldn't continue. If you had tried to explain that it was over for you, I said, barely holding back my anger. But you didn't say anything. She looked at me, and in her eyes, there was something cold, something final. She didn't even try to get up from the couch. She didn't move. She was behind the bars of her own world, and I no longer had a place in it. You don't love me anymore? I asked, not believing my own words. I knew the answer, but I hoped she'd say something different. That her words would be softer. I don't know. Her reply struck like a hammer. I don't know what you want from me. My hand gripped the door handle, and I felt the tension in my body rise. All I wanted was to hear something from her that would remind me of the warmth we once had. But in her eyes, all I saw was emptiness, and that meant there was nothing left. I turned and stepped toward the door, but as soon as my fingers touched the handle, I froze. Something inside me snapped, and I couldn't leave anymore. Time stopped. I was wrong, I said, almost whispering. I thought you would come back, that you would fix everything, that we would go back to what we had. She remained silent. I turned, but her eyes didn't move from where she sat. I knew it was final. I knew that everything I had known and believed in no longer mattered. The silence in the hallway was unnervingly loud. My legs couldn't stay still. My heart was pounding so hard in my chest that it felt like it might burst out. I took another step back, trying to leave, but some inner voice made me stop. I couldn't just leave. This was my home, my life, and now I was deprived of the ability to change anything. I couldn't understand how this had happened. I quietly slipped back to the door and, leaning against the wall, I listened to their conversation again. The words sliced through the air more and more. Do you think this was right? Kate finally spoke. I could feel her voice trembling. This was the moment when the cracks between us finally began to show. But she still wouldn't admit it. All I could feel was the echo of her empty words. You knew it would turn out this way, Michael answered. His voice remained firm, confident, as though he had won this game long before I entered the room. I gritted my teeth, inhaling sharply. This moment, this scene, felt like some kind of terrible joke. I could hear her breath becoming deeper, as if she was trying to say something, but the words wouldn't come. And then, like a knife, it struck me. She never intended to come back to me. This woman I loved was now sitting next to another man, and she didn't feel shame or remorse. She was ready to leave. Leave forever. I was ready to break apart. Are you out of your mind? I finally blurted out, though I didn't want to say it. My voice was controlled, but I couldn't catch my breath. I couldn't understand what was happening. How could she just sit there so calmly? How could she look at me like I was a stranger? I threw the door open. My eyes searched for her, as if it might change the situation. She didn't move from her spot, still sitting next to him, his face calm, without a trace of worry. My hand was shaking, and I tried to hide my fear and rage. Suddenly, I realized I could no longer bear the silence. You can't just leave, Kate, I shouted, unable to hold back the disappointment, pain, and anger. You didn't explain anything, you didn't even try. Why couldn't you tell me that something had broken between us? Why did you choose this? Why him? She looked at me. In her eyes, there was coldness. I didn't see pain, I saw only emptiness. Silence hung between us until her lips finally parted. You won't understand. Her voice was quiet but firm, as though she had already made this choice long ago. You don't want to understand that it's all over between us. You were busy with your work, with your world, and I just couldn't be alone anymore. Her words seemed to cut through my veins, severing me from reality. I couldn't believe that this wasn't the Kate I knew. The woman standing before me was a stranger, and I was completely unprepared for it. Everything I knew, all the moments we shared, it all seemed empty. I wanted to turn and leave, but I couldn't. I had to stay. I had to hear it all. Michael stood up from the couch and calmly approached me. His gaze was like ice. He didn't flinch, didn't take a step back. He stood there like a winner, looking at me as though I was just some unnecessary element. He clearly wasn't a regretful person. On the contrary, he seemed to be enjoying the situation. "You saw what's happening here, so don't play the victim," he said, sneering. "You were blind and deaf, and now you need to accept that this is your reality." I felt the blood pounding in my temples, everything inside me boiling. I knew he was right, but that didn't give me the strength to accept that I was shattered. Everything I had built, everything I had considered mine, had crumbled. The pain was unbearable. I finally managed to say, "You're probably right. This is my reality, and you're in it, too. But you don't even understand that I can't stay here anymore. I'm leaving." Kate didn't look at me, she was silent, just sitting next to him, no longer trying to hide anything. I couldn't stand next to her anymore. I turned to leave, but before I stepped out, I heard her final words, "Go, this is not your home anymore." And when I walked out, it felt like the world had collapsed around me, leaving only an empty, lifeless shell. The next morning, I woke up with the feeling that it had all just been a nightmare, and maybe it was all some kind of mistake. But as soon as I opened my eyes and saw the emptiness beside me, I understood, nothing would change. She was there, but she wasn't. We were there, but no longer together. When I got out of bed, I felt a weight on my chest, as if something huge and heavy was sitting on my shoulders. I walked into the bathroom, looked at myself in the mirror, and tried to find something familiar in my reflection. But it was a stranger's face. My gaze was dull, my eyes with red circles. I felt like a person who had lost themselves. I tried to remember the couple that used to sit on the couch in our cozy home, but even the memories seemed foggy, like an old movie. The entire day I spent in emptiness, chewing over all the words, all the looks. Every attempt to talk to Kate ended with me hitting her coldness, her silence. It was like trying to talk to a stone wall, where every attempt to reach something human met resistance, with no signs of regret or remorse from her. In the evening, once again returning home, I found her in the same spot. Kate was sitting on the couch, her gaze tired but still cold. She didn't expect me, didn't greet me as she used to, with a light smile. Everything felt too alien. I asked myself again why I was still trying to change something when she had obviously already made her decision. I walked to the table, grabbed the folder with the documents, and placed it in front of her. She raised her gaze but didn't say a word. I felt like her eyes didn't see me, she didn't even see us, the two people who once meant something to each other. There was no pain, no disappointment, just emptiness. "I'm filing for divorce," I said quietly, firmly. These words sounded like a verdict. I could no longer stay in this maze of lies and cold silence. Kate looked at me and something in her eyes changed. But it wasn't regret or sorrow. It was something close to relief. She didn't try to stop me, didn't try to explain. She just watched as I made the final decision. "Are you sure?" Her voice was low, but there was no pain in it, it was almost indifferent. "Yes, I'm sure," I answered, feeling the last threads connecting us snapping. I didn't want to regret my decision, but this moment was still heavy. I knew it was the right choice. I knew I couldn't keep living in this emptiness. I looked at her one last time, like a stranger. We were no longer the people who once shared this home, this life. We were no longer a couple. "Do you want to say anything?" I asked, standing by the door. She was silent, and in that silence, there was more than in any word. That was the end. I closed the door behind me, leaving everything behind.